The opinions and views expressed by individuals during this broadcast are their own and may not be the opinions of this network, their group, or other organization they may be involved with.
Open your eyes.
Everyone, and welcome to Open Your Eye for today on Thursday, November. I almost said November. I'm having a day. February the 15th in 2024. And we are, of course, the podcast focused on the use of psychedelics as medicine with two patients flying through that realm of psychedelic medicine. Myself, Kim Cooper, and my awesome joint host in the house, Tarra Simpson. That way, there you are.
How's it going, Kim?
It's going. I'm having a day.
Yeah.
I'm having a day.
It's snow.
It's the snow. I got a lot on my head, actually, today. I want to give a couple of shout outs and dedicate this show to two very important people in my life, two very extraordinary individuals in the natural therapy, natural medicine space. First off, friend of this show, near and dear to both of our hearts, Mr. Thomas Hartle. Thomas is back in hospital. He had another reoccurring problem with his stomach cancers. They went in and they did some surgery. They removed more of this man's intestines and stomach pieces. It was touch and go, but he has come through the surgery yet again and is posting selfies of himself with that marvelous smile of his on social media. So shout out to Thomas Hartle, man. We're all here pulling for you, dude. We love you.
You know, it gives me goosebumps just hearing that because it's so Thomas, and nothing keeps him down for long. It's just his mindset and his amazing outlook on even the worst of what we would think are the worst of situations. So it doesn't surprise me that he pulled through, because if he didn't, it means there was nothing more that could be done. He has work still to do here on this earth, and he's not ready to go yet. So
I agree.
Thank God he's still with us.
Yeah, I agree. So shout out to Thomas Hartle. The second patient person in the industry here that I would like to shout out to is somebody very close to all of us, Neil Magnuson from Vancouver, British Columbia. He is, of course, the head of the cannabis substitution program out there in BC. He's launched cannabis substitution programs in various cities across this nation to help people use cannabis to get off hard drugs, street drugs. Amazing individual that has fought for over 2 decades for patients' rights, equal access, low barrier access, and just overall freedom for this plant. Talking about cannabis, of course, he is now battling his own battle with cancer, esophageal cancer. It was announced on his podcast last night. Neil, man, we all love you. We're all pulling for you. If you need anything, you reach out and it is yours. There is absolutely no question on that. And I would also like to note that Neil will be joining us on Peace News and Views for a full interview on exactly what's going on with him, his court case in BC for low barrier access for cannabis substitution program, as well as his new diagnosis of esophageal cancer. He'll be joining us on March the 6th, Wednesday on Peace News and Views.
Amazing. Amazing. It'll be good to get a nice update and find out where we're going from here with Neil. It's going to be quite the journey.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Tonight's podcast, we are, of course, the podcast focused on the use of psychedelics as medicine. We are going to be speaking about psychedelics as medicine. We're also going to be speaking about cannabis as medicine, because there's a lot going on in that space out in BC with tonight's guest. Is very immersed into that space. Cannabis is also natural therapy and considered a psychedelic medicine in a lot of circles out there. So we are going to be discussing this as well as traditional psychedelic medicines here tonight with tonight's guests. I'm really excited to get started with a returnee and a great friend of mine, a great friend of the show. We'd like to introduce you to Mr. Robert Laurie in the house, lawyer extraordinaire. Good evening, Robert. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much again for having me. What a week. What a week it's been.
It's been a week. It's been a month. It's been a year.
Very sorry to hear about Neil. And Neil's a very, I would consider Neil a good friend. Former client. We've had some adventures together, and to hear that news is very sad. So I'm going to do my absolute best. Neil, if you're listening or watching, let's try to connect very soon and connect. It's been a while, and great to hear about Thomas Hartle. I had the fortune of assisting Paul Lewin and the TheraPsil litigation team on assisting Mr. Hartle with that first Section 56. And I've never met Thomas, but I feel like we should have a meeting one of these days, because it would be, again, you summed him up, everything I've read about him, and the courage to take the government to task the way he has. I wish him nothing but the best, and hope for a speedy recovery.
Absolutely amazing individuals. Both these gentlemen are just amazing individuals. The drive and the fight that they have to gain access to equal rights in this space for natural therapy. They're both heroes in this space. They truly are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Absolutely. And you're no slouch there, Mr. Laurie, either. You've been at this for quite a while, doing lots and lots of stuff on your end. More recently, you've been involved in the grassroots Indigenous movement, and I think that may be a good place to start with tonight. Let's visit that, because I know there's a lot going on in BC with the community safety unit showing up on native land and stuff. Let's dive into that conversation. Give us an update. What the hell is going on in BC?
Well, thank you. I'll do my best to try to take you through some pretty complicated topics, and we'll go from there. So, for 10 years, Ad Lucem, my law practice, celebrated 10 years in July. And, going back to August 2013, when I was sort of, young and early days of, holy shit, I'm running my own practice. Very much like the first couple episodes of Better Call Saul, where I went back to basics to do legal aid. So actually, I practiced in big law firms, big corporate firms like Suits, which, when you have to operate on your own in the big bad world and figure things out, you got to get that experience. So I did family legal aid cases, some criminal legal aid, and constitutional. So I ended up getting faxed one day a Indigenous hunting and fishing case in Haida Gwaii. So the government paid for me to go up and represent this nephew of a hereditary chief who, on a summer holiday, they decided to go out and shoot seals and sea lions with his uncle. Which in any event, that kind of set the scene for involvement with Indigenous work, and it was more or less at that time. I was involved with cannabis work because it was my own firm, that the cannabis and Indigenous practice of mine has really evolved over the last 10 years. And so bringing things forward, I had all that experience back like 2016, culminating in the Vancouver dispensary test case. All of that was really a good warm up for what we're doing now, because all of that work is totally relevant. And in the context of Indigenous, which if medical patients have certain constitutional rights and entrenchment, well, Indigenous have this on like levels that are beyond medical patients, and the deference that the courts, certainly the Supreme Court and the superior courts of the provinces, you have to give and are obliged to give deference, and much more deference than you would say entertaining the rights of medical patients. So all that being said, for the last, maybe when the test case ended, Indigenous folks started coming out saying, hey, we saw what you did with the test case. And what, you know, they kind of joked and say, we saw what you could do with a losing hand. Let's see what you can do with a couple of kings. So I thought that's really interesting. And so groups came forward that were like, Robert, you know, we want to talk to you about sovereign rights and issues that surround Aboriginal rights, and this thing called UNDRIP, which stands for the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is quite fascinating because it's a UN convention that effectively was passed into law federally through the UNDRIP Act. And then British Columbia is the first and only province to pass like this international convention or the spirit of it into BC law. But here's the fun part. They haven't really figured out what the hell any of that means. And on, you know, to take it a step further, you have within the last few years, you've probably heard of these old doctrines of discovery and terra nullius, which, and you know, to put it shortly, ultimately those were the doctrines that effectively gave white man in the church effectively the right to take lands in the name of church and state while not recognizing Indigenous title or claim to land. And even, you know, if you look back to the Royal Proclamation, which again provided for the rights of Indigenous, going back to the 1700s or late 1800s, none of that's really been given any effect. And so this UNDRIP is interesting because it technically challenges some of the ways the federal government have had their relationship as stewards of First Nations land. And UNDRIP doesn't apply to, you know, Indian land, as you know, under the Indian Act. UNDRIP applies to traditional lands.
Right.
So to bring it back to my Corey Brewer case in Vernon, Corey approached me as one of those young Indigenous that were saying, well, hey, if we've got these rights and, you know, territorial land is different than the crown land, and, you know, what would the law say if we opened up our stores on and off reserve? And Corey thought, well, the airport, that's downtown Vernon, and downtown Vernon is our traditional lands under UNDRIP. Let's see what we can do. So he opened an Indigenous healing center. I mean, it was a cannabis dispensary and a whole lot more. They had the endorsement of the, you know, chiefs, the matriarchs, the regional chief. They'd written a letter saying this is really great for Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, and anyone else who has an interest in Indigenous healing and practices. In any event, there was a very positive article written about this dispensary. And the CSU then visited them back in 2020 and then raided them shortly after. And jumping forward to May of last year, the CSU wouldn't return the cannabis and wouldn't compensate and effectively rendered their final decision. This is the Community Safety Unit, which is a provincial you know, enforcement arm. And so we had a final decision, which meant we had 30 days to file a constitutional challenge and a notice of charter challenge. And what was great, it was like literally like dusting off the test case work and, adding some additions from Jack and Kirk that have, transpired since 2015. So we filed that. And the case basically sets out that we're going to go for not just charter rights, like, 10 milligrams and patient access, but Indigenous have this whole other framework called Section 35 existing Aboriginal rights. And, because I spend a lot of time around cannabis, I do feel that the plant does very much talk to me. And one of the thoughts that I had, is that plus Jamie Shaw told me that when you look at the definition, she smokes a lot of pot. So in any event,
I love Jamie Shaw.
yeah. So Jamie, about when the Cannabis Act just came out or was about to, the definition, she's like, look at the definition of cannabis. Go to Schedule 1, right? Jamie sort of has that growl, right? Anyway, the definition of cannabis in Schedule 1 includes phytocannabinoids of cannabis and non-derived cannabis plants regardless of source. So technically, like kale and echinacea have phytocannabinoids in them, right? So technically, an Indigenous band making their own echinacea tincture would require a processing license under the Cannabis Act, right? Yep. But so if you look at this, where it comes down to, Indigenous have been the stewards of their own land since time immemorial. I mean, even the former Indigenous minister, Mark Miller, regarded Indigenous as the first agricultural innovators. So if we look at plants, seeds, gathering, foraging, access and trade of plants, phytocannabinoids and medicinal plants, right? This lumps cannabis, beyond nation to nation trade, which is a whole other line of argument here. But I think, what this does is this brings us potentially into the case law that's decided Indigenous have existing rights with gambling, tobacco, hunting, fishing, foraging, right? Now, part of the test is you have to say that the federal government, there's no evidence of extinguishing that practice. However, in the case of Vernon and Kamloops, and I got retained to do legal work with the Kamloops Teshwetmut, which is the Kamloops band, and in Corey's Okanagan Indian band in Vernon. And what's really cool about this particular narrow corridor of the interior is there was a Scottish anthropologist named James Alexander Tate. And I mean, this guy, like Jim Dunbar of Dances with Wolves, was a Scotsman who ended up in like Spence's Bridge embedded. So he completely archived the language of like the Okanagan Indian band, Upper Silkameen, Lower Silkameen, Nicola Indian band, all in that. In fact, his work to this day is considered, like scholarly and like an archive of this. So the interesting thing is, in Okanagan, have a word like Spetsin. I'm not pronouncing it, but that's Indian hemp. It, as the word, is very close to, looks similar to the word they have for rope, right? Now, Kamloops, who are neighbors just a bit to the north, have a word called, again, Spetsin, which is like a hemp, and then Yuli, which is Y-U, the number 7, L-I. Again, my pronunciation, forgive me, but it's cannabis, right? So to me, I think that a lot of this history of, the Europeans brought hemp to the New World, I think that there is evidence of this that have been brought over much earlier. I mean, the Vikings, if you want to say the Europeans, the Vikings were fuckloads before Christopher Columbus, John Cabot, and Jacques Cartier and the rest of them. And even if you look at the log records, someone sent these to me, but like when they landed, they're like, there's hemp, it's everywhere, they're growing it, and so to me, I think there's this Smithsonian whitewashing of history where, we all grew up thinking like the First Nations were living in the woods like Ewoks, when the reality is there seems to be evidence of mega civilizations like in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico and in other parts in eastern United States. So in a way, this whole, the doctrines of terra nullius and discovery been repealed by the church and state, which means there's holes in the 2 to 400 years of the common law, which arguably those bastardized doctrines influence the common law. And if they're now repealed, there's a hole. And what do we fill that hole with, my lord, my lady? UNDRIP, reconciliation, anything else we can throw at the wall that will stick. And so just to sum up, because thank you for giving me the floor just to talk about the context before we get to what happened yesterday.
Yeah.
But basically, I've widened the pleadings to not just cannabis. Just think about it. We got mushrooms up and down the coast and in the interior, northern, southern hemispheres. These species have psilocybin and psilocin in them, right? So I think that we have good arguments for both. We've got to still get more arguments. But ultimately, this leads to, why does the CSU, who's provincial, have really any say over any of this? And because Indigenous have been excluded from really any participation or consultation in cannabis, which we all remember, right? And now they're like, oh, let's consult and see and now include them, where really, to me, I think they don't know what to do until someone can prove something. So really, just to conclude, you have Jack Lloyd involved with this other lawyer on a group, the Amiqua Challenge, as I call it, in Ontario Superior Court, which is bringing similar issues that, yes, cannabis, trade, use, access, interaction, etc., has been in existence prior to contact, and that right has not been extinguished, so to speak. And in BC with the Brewer case. And so let me just conclude there before I jump off on the next piece of what happened yesterday.
Okay, yeah, and just, to your point as well, there's been seekers of the truth that have been diving into the archives here in Ontario on native land and stuff, and pulling up ancient texts and documents and that kind of thing to prove that, cannabis / hemp has been part of native culture since the dawn of time.
Well, the Mohawks have a great case. There's good history in Mohawk territory.
Yeah, and Mohawk territory, and that's what I'm talking about. When with Cartier coming down, the St. Lawrence and that kind of thing. I mean, he has it documented in his text, in his own hand, that he watched the native people harvesting the hemp from the shores. So, I mean, that was happening upon his arrival. So it was already here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then again, you look at records of the Spanish, if coming up that way into the Americas, up through Mexico, the end of the day, if this plant originated in Central Asia, if we agree in the foothills of the Himalayas or in Asia Minor, Silk Root, Spice Root, whatever, the movement of people and plants, and with cannabis being so central as a medicine, that plant, just like the mushrooms, and that's Paul Stamets's big thesis, is mushrooms have moved from the beginning of Africa to the movement of people, and the expansion outward has led to fungi spores moving with people, crossing waters and ships and boats, and it growing on dung and cow pats and so on in two hemispheres. So I think there's a lot more to this, and it's exciting to be a lawyer, but also an amateur anthropologist on the side.
Yeah. Because you need some minors in anthropology to get through and sift through a lot of this information and disinformation that is out there and readily available. I mean, the seed trade was flourishing across the lands everywhere prior to Europeans arriving in North America.
Yeah, which again, UNDRIP, I think, is potentially, it has the potential to really shake the system. Now, what that all eventually amounts to, anyone's guess at this point. But the way I look at it, why I'm so interested in it as a lawyer is, you representing industry is fine, but there aren't the same level of charter argument that can be brought. And in many ways, I've said this to like craft association and cannabis retailer groups that like my clients don't need you at all, quite frankly. But you need them, because ultimately if they get and win the challenges and strike down laws, that means that could open things up for the larger market. And just to segue into a point before I get into what happened yesterday, Jack Lloyd and Kurt have been representing the VCBC, which is our good friend Ted's case.
Yes.
So I approached Ted. I love Ted. I got huge respect. Before I decided to sue the city in the test case, I actually went over to the island to get permission from like Ted and Kirk. I was like, hey, before I start rattling my own like saber, just want to make sure I don't piss on anyone's shoes. And then I go, but if I do hit the ice and drop gloves, you guys are going to clear the bench and back me, which everyone did. So it's cool. But I phoned up Ted and said, listen, I have a proposition for you. My client hasn't been involved in medicinal cannabis for 27 years and had a history of successful charter challenges involving VCBC edibles and the most compassionate of compassionate access. So I said, how about this? None of you have any Indigenous standing or potential argument. What if we merged our cases because they both involve the CSU? Now, this has not been confirmed, but everyone's interested in the idea because it's like chocolate and peanut butter. They will argue the Section 7 charter, 10 milligram edible, those wonderful charter arguments. But we can argue the complementary Indigenous arguments and, in a way, complement each other's blind spot, avoid duplication of proceedings with judges and courts and prosecutors and Crown. Everybody's up for that. So I think there could very well be, again, an opportunity for us all to work together again on this case, which is, I guess, a nice segue into what happened yesterday.
Yeah, that is entirely too cool. I mean, to have all of you teamed up to go after the CSU, that would be absolutely epic. So what happened yesterday?
Well, what happened yesterday ties in with everything we set up for, which involved me being a cannabis lawyer and for the last year representing Indigenous dispensaries and, just effectively being prepared for sort of the inevitable. And, yesterday, after about a month or so ago, the CSU came up and did their education visit, right, which basically is if you don't close down or voluntary compliance, well, we'll show up and raid you effectively. And that happened yesterday. They showed up to Comox on this area called Dyke Road, which is sort of a mini Green Mile in a way, because there's 4 dispensaries selling Indian weed or red market cannabis, right? And so the CSU and the RCMP had like 4 separate, but they did it all continuous, like boom, here they are. So I got a call at about 10:42. I live in Nanaimo, and so I was like, well, all right, let's go meet the CSU. So I jumped in the car with the dog and drove up island. And I mean, with technology the way it is, you can be in your office anywhere. And I love the road and, being out in the field. So I did exactly that. Just rolled up, parked in the back, walked up. And, it was interesting enough. It was the senior CSU officer, Doug Warren, who I have a lot of respect for, but we met in person for the first time yesterday. So I was like, walked up and like, Doug, what are you doing? I thought we had an understanding. I sent you an email 2 days ago that we were going to voluntarily, when my client who's out of the office on personal admin, he's back next week, that I said to you, like, they want to come and meet with the CSU and figure out rules of engagement and discuss, I guess, orderly surrender, if you will.
Yeah, civil. Right?
And anyway, he smiled at me. He says, Mr. Laurie, we had an understanding to have a meeting. I'm just doing my job. So at the end of the day, I smiled and then I, because at the end of the day, you got to work with these people and you'll see them again on other files. And there is some give and take. And, but I asked him, I said, were you invited on to, banned land by chief and council? On whose authority are you here this morning? And he thought very carefully, and he answered honestly, which is we're here of our own provincial authority. And he didn't need to explain the law and the section. And I said to him, okay, well, I view your actions with all due respect as an unnecessary abuse of process. Because, we had a understanding and, figured there would be a discussion and a dialogue. And the band's been kind of both sides. They don't want to commit, but they also don't want to piss off the government on a cannabis issue. But it's now forced their hand where now you have a government, and Indigenous, whether you like it or not, are the fourth level of government. And so if you come in and do a raid on chief and council's territory and you haven't said, hey, we'd like your permission, or are you requesting our assistance, right? Just showing up and then penalizing, because I've had other situations up in other parts of BC where you had another band, had their people of a different nation selling cannabis on a dispensary on another band's nation. CSU raid them, but you had the chief of the land who's been raided saying, why the fuck do you come here? Well, they didn't say the F word, but it's basically like, why did you come here? Why did you come here? And you're now seeking to impose a penalty in my territory or our banned land without free and informed consent from us before you now seek to enforce. So, at the end of the day, it's interesting because there's all these little subtleties and checks and balances. And, like on the one hand, yeah, the CSU can do what they're doing. But by the other token, these Indigenous groups can reopen, which I'm instructed a bunch of them did today. And we'll be challenging the matter in court. So I did, continue my conversation just with the CSU saying, that, well, with all due respect, just putting you on notice that we're most likely going to bring now or try to bring an application in Victoria in the Superior Court to see about a stay or an injunction so that the CSU doesn't come around any longer until the charter constitutional issue has been decided. Because at the end of the day, if this is a serious enough health and safety issue, then the RCMP should be dealing with it. But it isn't. And coming onto banned land is the community safety unit. It's like, which community are you concerned with? And whose safety do you speak of? You really should be called the government excise unit, because that's really what you're doing. Is you're just going around and enforcing and taking the cannabis because that's a direct challenge to your excise and revenue generating activities. So
Exactly.
the end of
That's
the day,
exactly what it comes down to.
and just one final piece before I've done let pause and just sort of see where we're at. But the BC government has a legal program that they call a Section 119. And a Section 119 is Section 119 or 119 of the Cannabis Control and Licensing Act of British Columbia. In that act, there's provision or that section that allows chief and council, not individual Indigenous, but band chief and council to enter into what is kind of colloquially known as a Section 119 agreement. But the problem with that is think about like the floor. If the Indigenous are crossing the floor off reserve and off banned land and, from their jurisdiction and are now entering into a contract under Section 119 with the BC government, that sounds a lot like a treaty. And a treaty, right? And a treaty, like a contract, is designed to extinguish rights if they're not clarified within the contract or the document, which is a treaty. So when you have these like about 9 or 10 last time I checked, Indigenous groups went 119. And they've had various degrees of success. Some have thought it's the best thing ever, but they initially thought they were going to be the only nation doing it. Now any other nation is just cutting into their profit share. And the ones thought they were going to make more money. They're realizing that the margins are razor thin, more so when you're doing it illegal. And so one group, Williams Lake First Nations, which were one of the original Section 119s, just decided, F you, we're opening our own. They have a legal store, Chief Willie Sayers and Sugar, Sugar Leaf or whatever. It's a big Indigenous success story. Yeah. But they allowed another group just to say, fuck it. And they opened an illegal edibles shop, right? So I ended up contacting the CSU on another matter, just saying, and I sent them the news articles. I'm like, how are you going to deal with these lawbreakers, right? Selling edibles on, without a license, doing exactly what my clients have allegedly done. Where's the double standard? Yeah. So in any event, it's an interesting time, because if the government is so cocksure that these are the rights, they would have, I think, treated this a lot different, where they acknowledge reconciliation. They're acknowledging UNDRIP, but it's kind of lip service with regards to what does that actually mean and what is acceptable. Because if there's over 200 bans, let's say, and you've got 10, and they got to get that sweet spot majority or keep coercing and raiding the sovereigntists into going legal, I don't know if they'll be able to get everybody before the case or the larger issue. This isn't just cannabis, right? This is effectively Aboriginal rights.
That's right.
Which is,
it's going to cover a whole friggin' host of things, natural therapy, under the guise of natural therapy. And I know for many Indigenous communities, that includes things like peyote. As an Indigenous medicine. Time ticked away on us there. We are at the point of the show we like to call medication time. We're going to take a real quick break, and then we're going to talk more about Indigenous land as well as psychedelic therapy on those lands and throughout Canada and the world when we come back with more with Robert Laurie. We'll be back in about 4 minutes and 20 seconds. So hang in there. Stay tuned.
Are you frantically pounding away on your keyboard these days to discuss your views, share your passions, teach a skill, or share a craft to the masses on social media? Podcasting is a bright light that can help you reach a diverse audience. And NOK Network can help. Even if you have no experience, NOK Network will work with you to develop your content to air on our diverse network to reach a wide audience, allowing us all to grow together. Podcasts are aired on multiple platforms simultaneously, across social media and streaming sites, live through our network. Contact us and let's chat about how we can help you develop your podcast and join the NOK team. Advertising space available at NOK. Contact us for a rate sheet at knocknetwork.com. Send us a message on our social media platforms or email us at info@noknetwork.com.
Psychedelic Tuesdays on NOK Network. Tune in at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Psychedelic Reporters. Bufo Alvarius is scouring the newswires for stories being reported in the mainstream media on the psychedelic front and passing them on to Hobby's Puppets and Tarra Simpson so they can bring them to you, our listeners, in this 60-minute video news podcast. Tuesday evening news. Join us for Tuesday evening news each week at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for all your news and information from the world of psychedelic medicine. Follow and subscribe to NOK Network on our webpage, social media, and streaming sites, including YouTube and Rumble.
Are you a Northern Ontario resident? Searching for credible information on cannabis as a medicine? No Sir is here to help. Established in 2013, Northern Ontario Cannabis Education and Resources is here for you. No Sir Director Kim Cooper brings you 45 plus years experience utilizing cannabis as a medicine and is spreading the education across the North. Activism, resources, referrals, and more at No Sir. Don't be a jackass. Say no sir to cannabis propaganda with No Sir. Find us at www.nocer.ca.
Peace, news, and views on NOK Network. Patients everywhere advocating cannabis evolution with Kim Cooper and Sir Steve O. Joint hosts interview people in the grassroots and corporate cannabis space across North America and beyond. Sit down with patients, entrepreneurs, lawyers, doctors, and others share their journey with this medicinal plant. So join us for Peace, News, and Views. Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, where all consumption is medicinal consumption on NOKnetwork.com. Follow and subscribe to NOK Network on social media and streaming sites including Facebook, YouTube, and Rumble.
Now we get back to the show.
We're back from our medication session here on Open Your Eye, streamed live on streaming sites, including social media platforms, Facebook, Rumble, Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn, and I think that's it right now. We are no longer streaming on YouTube.
Yeah, YouTube doesn't like us.
No.
Apparently, we tell too much truth. So we've been banished.
They like took away everything. There's you can search YouTube for NOK Network, nothing's going to come up. It's all gone. They deleted the entire account.
Wow, that's unreal. Like the hate that they have for us.
The hate is real. The hate is real. We will be expanding to other platforms. I'm just trying to figure out which one is the easiest one to stream to, and that'll be happening at some point in the spring with a new location. All right, we're going to get right back into it. No time to waste with this guy because he's like just a wealth of information and he can fill us in on so much. So right back at it with the one and only lawyer extraordinaire, Robert Laurie in the house. Welcome back, WB.
Hello.
Hello. A little bit on the psychedelic front. BC has always been sort of at the forefront, at the hub of everything that sort of starts in Canada for advancements on natural therapy patients' rights, individuality, all of that kind of thing. BC seems to be a catalyst for much of it that spreads across the country from there. There's been sales and proponents of psychedelic therapy, mushrooms in particular, in the province for a lot of friggin' years already, where, other parts of this country are just sort of starting up. So, I mean, do you foresee challenges coming to the Canadian government in the future that sort of start in BC to gain access to psilocybin and other such psychedelics, much the same as we saw start with cannabis?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think when they say history repeats itself, it it took 15 something years from RV Parker to, 2015 with Justin Trudeau being elected and legalization and all of that hubbub, that kind of perfect storm plus 15 years of what, John Conroy calls the litany of litigation, right? Which the federal government had to more or less be frog marched toward a line of what reasonable, dignified patient access looks like. And the other theory I have about, why BC? And hang on, just before we jump to that, don't forget Paul Lewin you should have as a guest, because he's filed a Section 2B charter challenge dealing with psilocybin and freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. So, that is a made in Ontario case right there. But let's jump to B.
Paul. I mean, he was a mentor of mine as well. Him and Jack both during my time at Normal Canada, and I worked under both of them, and I was
perfect.
I was unaware that there was a new filing.
Talk to Paul. Talk to Paul. Paul and I ended up presenting with Dr. Ken Tupper, who, he was Dennis McKenna's PhD student back at UBC, but he's with the BC Center of Substance Use. Oh, no, now is in the government. So he's had a little bit more, his activism is little because he's in the government now. But nonetheless, the three of us were guests at Vancouver Island University Psychedelic Assisted Therapy course, which was kind of cool because my wife's on that course. So I was like, I get to shout out to her. But Paul spoke about his case. But going to BC here, why BC? And I was a guest speaker at the Horizons Northwest Psychedelic Conference in Portland. And I went down there and I said, well, why Vancouver? Why has it been like the West is such a hotbed? And I said, well, we have you to thank after all. We have Richard Nixon to thank. Literally the draft. You sent your psychedelic problem children, your conscientious objectors all fled the U.S. and came to Canada. And I mean, there's no coincidence that Greenpeace started in Vancouver because of the Quaker movement, the ecology movement and environmental rights, which psychedelics came from that. I mean, you got to only just see the Greenpeace documentary, How to Change the World, where their second or so earlier, the early Greenpeace missions in Amchitka Island, they went on illegally into Alaska and Amchitka without going through customs after renting for $10,000 a halibut boat, a decommissioned halibut boat in the winter to go up to Amchitka to prevent atmospheric atomic testing. Well, they decided to go on shore of Amchitka and a bunch of them dropped acid. Too much acid, in fact, that's where the whales came from. We're like, fuck, we got to save. We're all connected.
Save the whales.
That's literally where all that started. And then the later campaigns where they literally were rolling the I Ching on where with CIA funds were funded intel so they could basically proxy and interfere with the Russians, who were the big whalers at the time. But that's why I think Vancouver has this tradition of being, in a way, the last outpost before you're really in the last, in the hills. And it's the gateway where East meets West. So part of all of that aforementioned discussion has largely been influenced by Eastern philosophy. Let's not forget, right? And the whole environmental peace movement really was about turning inward and turning eastward. So Vancouver, I'm a proud second-generation Vancouverite and a fourth-generation BC and an eighth-generation Canadian that, for me, involved in this game and this battle and these issues, for me, just feels like it's in my blood and my DNA, just given where I grew up. And just on a little side note, and a shout-out to Jody Emery, but I joke with her because I was in grade 11 where I showed up in my St. George's uniform with the patch and the blazer and the tie and walked right into what was called Hemp BC in those days, which was before cannabis culture. Walked right in thinking that someone was going to say, I'm sorry, son or kid, get out of here. No one gave a shit. So here I am looking at, they had like brochures on how to synthesize acid in those days you could buy for $10, along with like books and all sorts of stuff. So it's interesting. And I can share as well. I got invited last month to an Indigenous psychedelic healing circle that was put on by the practitioners who've been working with Kamloops, with the residential school survivors. So it was incredible when you take, like these protocols and the safety of the best practice, but then you interweave it with these traditional ways, and just how, we were taught to hold the medicine and talk to the medicine and even though we were dealing with ketamine for part of it, but, still it was like, medicine, I know you have things to teach me, but please, can you please teach me in a way that will get your message, but be gentle. So, and connecting with the earth and the importance of the element, and cedar as a cleansing agent, and the importance of creating a container and the ritual with that. And really, it was probably, I've been involved with psychedelic, where I've engaged and a participant in psychedelic therapy for probably the last 5 years. And I have to tell you, I was pretty broken at the end of the dispensary test case, which I've said in the past was akin to 2.5 tours of Vietnam, and then it ended. And then what do? I had to be a dad and engage and figure out all these things I was putting off,
it's almost
and address it.
PTSD-like, right? When you come
it
off
was very much
a high like that.
Yeah.
And the culmination of a lot of work, counseling, with family. And what's really beautiful is my wife, who was very skeptical about cannabis, and then she thought I was gone off the deep end with representing all the psychedelic stuff. But, she's seen how it's the effect it's had, and the changes home, and the cases I've been involved in, to the point that she's a nurse educator with Vancouver Island Health Authority and an RN, but she's signed up to do and is involved with the Vancouver Island University psychedelic assisted therapy program. So it's we're almost combining these worlds now. And it's really great because now I don't have to before it was eggshells around. You're doing what with who? Oh, and it's honey, this is all safe. You're gonna one day realize how silly, this all is. And in any event,
education that you're spreading, I mean, right there in your own home. You've educated a medical educator.
Well, and that's the cool thing, because nurses, doctors, first responders, police, everybody needs this, right? And so the really interesting, I guess, again, for me, with Greenpeace has always been an interest, even going to junior high, where we had this one teacher who, for whatever reason, in religion class, I was at Vancouver College in grade 10, puts in a movie which was a Greenpeace recruitment video. And I mean, these were on the speedboats. They were interfering with the man. We were cheering him on. It was incredible to see this. So learning more about Greenpeace, they took a lot of their tradition from their ethos from the Quaker tradition of bearing witness. And why that's important for me is how can you represent cannabis and psychedelic medicine or plant medicine if you haven't borne witness, and how do you know what you're talking about, right? So, I asked Dr. Janice Phelps a question when she was brought in as an expert in Thomas Hartle's case. And I mean, Janice was the first government-approved psychedelic therapist, through the California Institute of Integral Studies. So I asked Dennis, who should we speak to about psychedelic therapy? He goes, oh, you want to talk to Janice. So Janice was amazing with her time. And I asked her just straight off, Janice, or Dr. Phelps, could you be a sex therapist if you've never had sex before? And she laughed because she knew where I was going with that,
Right.
which was, can you be a psychedelic therapist if you've never taken fucking psychedelics before?
Exactly.
Right? And like, how can you?
I love that. You know, TheraPsil is doing that. They're pushing for, you know, practitioners to be able to have access to use this, and it is pivotal for them to understand what they're doing with their patients.
So Jack called me up and he's like, this was maybe April of COVID. And because again, I was doing all this, like hanging out with Dennis McKenna. I went to Peru with him, got my ayahuasca wings, got
you went hard, man. You went all in.
Like Paul Stamets and other folks like that, and Wade Davis, like meeting these idols and these like, you know, incredible people. And you know, just learning this sort of seeing the space that Jack calls me up. He's like, "Hey, man," you know, like Jack.
I love Jack.
I heard that you know Dennis McKenna and you might know Paul Stamets, and you've been hanging out with all these psychedelic people since the test case. And I was like, Jack, I can totally help you with this. Let me bring so literally dealing with all my like trauma with the test case and like running to psychedelics and just, I don't know, taking comfort in all of this. I was able to like connect these guys. Even Paul reached out after VIU and he's like, do you know any indigenous that are in the like psilocybin spiritual side? I was like, do I? Let me tell you about last month. Like, so I connect, you know, so in any event, I don't know. I just love the fact that I get to be almost a consigliere and be part of bridging worlds. And I mean, I've had some indigenous even say as far as, you're a firekeeper, which, you know, as a lawyer, that is a huge honor. So being in a position to, you know, get into these layers. And I mean, when I mentioned 10 years ago being on that case, like, to be honest, I was like a white dude standing outside like indigenous land, if you will, without any idea, just growing up with like the, you know, public school and the, you know, private school education, which really didn't have much of an indigenous component other than, you know, respect elders, respect the land, and respect people. There wasn't, you didn't know to the extent of residential schools and all of that. But I feel that in this 10 years and as a lawyer has enabled me to walk in some circles and be invited to meetings, literally pipe ceremonies, and other gatherings, including sweats, where, you know, most like other lawyers aren't going and doing that, right? So really, it just feels like going full circle. Because again, I was a young teenager when I first started getting interested in this stuff from reading like Aldous Huxley and Brave New World. And in Brave New World, they're all talking about doing peyote and the savages having natural births and all of this. And then when I met Dennis, he's like, what got you interested in psychedelics, right? And I was like, reading Brave New World. And he says, well, I hope you read The Island, because you have to read those two together to truly appreciate what Huxley was trying to tell us, right? So in a way, just now with being with, you know, cannabis and the indigenous and the psychedelics, it truly is the unholy alliance. And, you know, I wouldn't be wanting to doing anything other than what I'm doing to some extent.
You are fucking fabulous. You know that, my friend? I absolutely adore you.
I enjoy you too.
You're awesome.
Both of you.
You're perfectly fabulous. We killed an hour, man, like right quick, like nothing. I wish I had more time, but we are at the conclusion of the show. Of course, I'm going to have your ass back because we're nowhere near done yet. We have reached the portion of the show that we like to call the shout out time. It's time to cue the chickens. All right, Robert, how can we get a hold of you? Plug your websites, all the good stuff.
Okay. Robert Laurie, Ad Lucem Law Corporation. Google that. It'll come up like a rash. There's a web page in there somewhere, but I mean, look, if you can't find me, you probably won't be able to retain me. So I guess we could weed them out that way. Sorry. I don't know if I want to be equating clients with potential clients with natural selection. That might not be.
Anyway. You are fucking awesome. You are truly awesome. I mean, if I ever need a lawyer in this space, man, you're my call. There's no question.
And then we'll call Jack and Paul.
I'll call all three of you, man. I want the dream team. You've got to be part of that.
Look, you fuck up in BC, call me, right? But then we'll probably call Jack because he seems to be, he's officing out of Conroy's office. So that's his registered address in BC now. So anyway, yeah, you've got a friend in all of us. You put in your time. And I mean, a lot of us look up to you, Kim. And it's so awesome, Tarra, that you guys and you ladies in the show. So again, consider me on the show again very soon, because I'd love to update. And I think this case is going to, in the next 2 to 3 months, there'll be some dramatic changes, and we should hopefully know by then if we're combining our cases and where things are at.
Well, we'll get you back on in early spring. You can let me know if you are combining cases, and hell, let's bring in Jack and Paul as well. We can have a lawyers powwow here on the show. It would be fucking awesome.
We'll bring John Conroy and we'll call him Pat, but that'll be all good.
You're a fabulous dude, my friend. Fabulous dude indeed. And you will be back again very, very soon. Thank you for joining us tonight with our interview with Mr. Robert Laurie, lawyer extraordinaire. We hope you enjoyed tonight's podcast, and we have opened up the doors just a crack to your curiosity for you to go out there and find out more about psychedelic medicine and whether or not it's right for you. And just maybe you'll be able to open your eye. We'll be back again next week with another very special episode. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Have a great weekend. Peace.
Open your eye.